The African Revolution, Program 2. Uhuru means freedom.
In the eloquent melody of the Kikuyu tribe, they sang of freedom. Uhuru, they chanted, and only vaguely did they know what it meant. I stood outside the modern home of Jomo Kenyatta, about 30 miles from the city of Nairobi, and watched and heard these 50 Africans serenade their leader. He was asleep that day, as Africa has been asleep, and they wanted to wake him. Their song repeated over and over. Kenyatta, he will bring us happiness. Kenyatta will bring us freedom, with Mboya. They will save us. We will have the white man's land. There will be little work. Uhuru, freedom is coming. Freedom has come to much of East Africa already, and freedom soon will come to the rest of it. To parts of it, Tanganyika, it has come with a minimum of sorrow and violence. To another area, Kenya, there are critical problems still to solve, personalities to please, and the terror of Mau Mau to forget. Uganda, too, is involved in this surge to independence. But to these 50 Africans, swaying, rocking to melody, shuffling barefoot on the earth of their ancestors, the inevitable is yet to happen. The African Revolution is yet to come.
The African Revolution, a sound odyssey to a continent in turmoil. A 6-part study of Africa south of the Sahara based on a 15-country tour with tape recorder by broadcaster Harry Rasky. The second program in the series, a program titled Uhuru Means Freedom, visits East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika. We turn our attention first this evening to Kenya, slowest on the road to independence of all the East African territories, and yet in many ways the most advanced. Now, here's Harry Rasky to share with us his experience of Kenya.
In any dialogue on the past and potential of this remarkable East African country, some basic statistics are important. It is a land about the size of France or Canada's 4 Atlantic provinces, an area of 250,000 square miles with a population of an estimated 6.5 million, of whom more than 6.25 million are Africans. The largest minority group is not European, but Asian, about 175,000 Indians and Pakistanis. There are only about 68,000 white people. In other words, not much more than 1% of the population is European, and they have been there for only about 65 years. How they came and why was described vividly by Michael Blundell.
Well, I came out here in 1925 when I was a boy of 18, and I came in the traditional manner. I wanted to see what a new country was like. I felt called to Africa, and I suppose you can say I just hitched on to the last of the pioneer period, really.
Well, why was it that the Europeans were so late in coming to this area of Africa? I believe that in the early 1900s there were only about a dozen Europeans here.
Oh, well, that was because this part of Africa was only discovered as late as 1874. I'd like to put that vividly for people. When my father was born, or was a young man, a young boy, this part of Africa wasn't even known. And that is really the reason.
What life was like in Kenya early in this century is a living memory to Michael Blundell.
Oh, it was the most exciting country, but difficult to portray vividly to you in a few words. First of all, terribly remote and out of this world. There were only 12,000 Europeans in it, 2.5 million Africans. Even the beginnings of a civilized development in the form of roads and railways, even deep water berths in the harbor, had not begun. The valley I went to had only got 2 European women in the whole valley. Farms were being carved out of the bush. Many of the Africans went about without any clothes at all and didn't worry about it. Medical services had hardly begun. Twins were smothered at birth and used to be rescued by the missionaries, all these sort of things. And above all, of course, when I look back on it all, the thing that sticks out in my mind is how free the country was of problems and worries.
If once the country was free of problems and worries, that is far from the case now. Nowhere is the past and future more constantly debated than in the lush hills of the Rift Valley. There, in the town of Uhuru, I spoke to a rugged Scotsman, Sandy Wright.
I've just been 50 years in this country. And I'm a very disappointed man, and all I've worked for is of no account at all.
And Sandy Wright remembers what it was like in the beginning. Now, as the shadow of Uhuru independence hovers over the so-called White Highlands he loves.
Well, I should tell you what it was like then. There were no natives here of any account then. The Maasai had a claim, in a sense, to this area, in that they used Njoro to graze their cattle for never more than 3 months in the year because of a disease called cruitis. Nice euphemistic name. But the point is this, the natives who now lay claim to this land have no claim whatsoever. All these plains were bare of natives, and we were invited by our British government to take up these places. Delamere was the leader in the thing. And so the white man developed it until, for many years, he's been the main producer of the sole wealth of Kenya, which is agriculture, to the tune of 86%.
The question of the land is a crucial one. The Africans claim the white settlers swindled them out of their land, took the best part. Elspeth Huxley, one of the chief chroniclers of the constant crisis in Kenya, has a firm view on this.
That is wrong, yes. I mean to say, that is definitely wrong, yes. I mean, it's a very old statement, has been made many times, and it's only got a very small bit of truth in it. They've had a very small portion of the best land.
Is the best land still undeveloped then?
No, the best land is in the hands of the Africans, and it's not fully developed.
There is little question that the law, until recently, favored the European. In fact, in the area known as the White Highlands, some 16,000 square miles, some say a quarter of all the arable land in Kenya, there was a time when a European farmer was even prohibited from employing a non-European as a manager. Not until 1960 were the race barriers entirely removed from the land. The African feels strongly on this matter of the land, as explained by Michael Blundell.
Now, there are two issues here, and they are controversial ones. The first, in my view, is that unhesitatingly the British government made some mistakes, and some African land was taken and alienated. Now, the second issue is a much more difficult and emotional one. The extreme African nationalist view feels that all the soil of Africa belongs to them, and resents the intrusion of what they consider the alien white man. That is a sort of political view which people like myself are trying to counter, because we think that the European or white man born in Africa is just as much an entitlement to being an African as the African. But that particular issue is a very explosive one.
Some African leaders have openly told the masses that they will take over the rich white lands when independence comes and turn them over to the black Africans. This question was put to Jomo Kenyatta, the bearded leader alleged to have masterminded the Mau Mau terror of a few years ago. His answer is important because it is assumed that he will be the independent Kenya's first prime minister.
Well, I don't know whether you know my policy or not. I hate to enter into controversial business. You know my declared idea, and I think you have read it many times. I still stick, I don't care what somebody else say, but I still stick to my statement that all rights to private property must be guarded, and I have not moved from that line.
Before the Europeans came to Kenya, the Africans there were chiefly nomadic, and even today most of them still cultivate land at a subsistence level. Everywhere you go, beside the road you see village compounds, mud huts crammed together to form a tight private settlement. Today, the labor force of the entire country amounts to only about 600,000 people, only about 10% of the total population. For the most part, Kenya is arid and poor, and there are vast sparse areas with isolated communities. The isolation and distance has bred differences. Tribal feelings and hatreds run deep. The whole question of tribalism is a barrier to an independent, unified Kenya. Perhaps in the songs of the people you can hear the sounds of clashing worlds. For each tribe has its own world, its pride and prejudice. This is the sound of the Kikuyu. They are the largest tribe in Kenya, about 20%. This song is called Uhuru, a dance song at ceremonial occasions. Each tribe has its distinctive music and instruments. And here is the sound of the Luo tribe. They make up 15% of the country's African population. The song is called Odongo. It's a song of praise at a drinking party. The instrument is called the thum. The third largest tribe is the Baluya, a different kind of people with a different music. Everywhere in Africa, the beast of burden is the woman. You see her carrying the wares of the world on her head and back. This Baluya song, Mama Wee, is sung by women on their way back from fetching firewood in the forest. Uninvolved in politics, uneducated, these silent bearers of burdens are the great unknown factor in all of Africa. These are the women of perhaps the bravest and most legendary of all African tribes, the Maasai. They are warriors and herdsmen. They are a disappearing breed. How deeply the tribal feelings go and what it means is expressed by Elspeth Huxley.
I would say they go back to the origins of human society in Africa. They are the thing to which you belong. Each tribe has its own language, its own government, its own custom. They are a people. When they're big enough, they're called a nation. And it is, of course, a fact that among the younger, educated people, there is a great movement not to abolish tribalism, I don't speak abolish your tribe, but to form a common front.
Among the African leaders themselves, there is great difference of feeling about how deeply tribal loyalties go. Jomo Kenyatta, a Kikuyu.
The tribal business has been so much magnified. It is not so acute as some people think.
But members of the smaller tribes fear that Kenyatta would lead a government dominated by the aggressive Kikuyu tribesmen. This is the feeling of 36-year-old Peter Okondo, parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance, a one-time supporter of Kenyatta, but the son and grandson of Baluya ancestors, traditional tribal enemies of the Kikuyu.
We have begun to feel, a large number of people have begun to feel that
we are sending away the British only to take on another kind of imperialism or a kind of dictatorship headed by Kenyatta in Kanu. And we are satisfied now that if that came about, then certain communities, certain areas like Abaluya, for instance, would be prepared to secede from the entity today called as Kenya. That is why I think that Kenyatta is most unlikely to be Prime Minister of independent Kenya.
In other words, if he were to take power, and it seemed as if the Kikuyu were going to gain dominance, you might see some secessionist movements as one found in the Congo after independence?
We would certainly secede in West Kenya. If Kenyatta took power and began to rule as he is likely to in a Kikuyu fashion, we would not stay in this entity called Kenya. We'll get out of it.
The fears of the minority tribes and groups in Kenya were heightened when Kenyatta finally made his move. When he was released from his long stay in jail, it was hoped he would unite the country. Now, in Kenya there are two main political parties, and they have similar sounding names. The Kenya African National Union, known as KANU, and the Kenya African Democratic Union, called KADU. Somehow it was thought Kenyatta, the legend that lives, would weave these two together. But last winter, while I was in Kenya, Kenyatta made his choice, and I was in the crowded committee room when the long-awaited announcement was read. He had accepted the leadership of KANU.
Decisions of KANU in recognition of Mr. Kenyatta's leadership records its appreciation of Mr. Kenyatta's decision to accept leadership of KANU, and accordingly unanimously resolves to give Mr. Kenyatta full powers to lead and reorganize KANU and all its sections, policy and a parliamentary group, with a view to setting up an efficient, effective, disciplined party determined to win Kenya's complete Uhuru now.
I stood beside Jomo Kenyatta as this choice was announced, and I asked him why he had waited so long to make his decision.
I have not waited long. Everything has its time, and I think this is the time.
It was a historic moment, this. Kenyatta had made his choice, and he chose to go with KANU, the party dominated by his own Kikuyu tribesmen, and thus he passed up the opportunity of bringing unity to a disunited country. His powerful figure casts a hypnotic spell over the people of Kenya. His name is Magic. The chanting began on cue. Outside the Parliament buildings, the mob gathered. For if Kenyatta chose to lead, it was argued, independence could not be far behind. But quietly, the real mastermind of Kenya is making his plans. Tom Mboya, the General Secretary of the Kenya African National Union Party, is waiting his turn. Only 31 now. He feels he can wait for the old man. Kenyatta is 71 and tired. He can wait his turn to become Prime Minister of Kenya. Mboya himself cleverly worked out the formula by which Kenyatta could head his party. His cold, wide eyes stared off in some distant time as we stood outside the legislature building in Nairobi, and I asked him if he thought the step to independence would come quietly.
Well, we are all hoping that it will. One of the fears at the moment is that there may be tribal clashes, and we're working very hard to ensure that we win our independence peacefully and in unity.
I wonder if you could tell me what the policy of your party is.
But that's a very broad question. Our party generally, of course, is for independence. That is one. That independence we feel should be based on democratic rights for all our citizens, with a government based on Africans. That does not mean that we intend to exclude the non-African immigrant communities who have decided to stay in Kenya. On the contrary, we intend to give each and every one of them the right to choose Kenya citizenship when independence comes, and once they choose to become Kenya citizens, then of course they'll enjoy equal rights with all our people. We do not feel that they should have dual citizenship because we are afraid that that might lead to sort of dual loyalties or double loyalties, and that may pose problems for us. Insofar as the economic development of our country is concerned, we intend to have a country which, of course, as in the case of most of the underdeveloped countries of the world, would have an economy sort of guided by the government, based on a government economic plan. This does not include private investment, but rather ensures that development is geared to meet certain urgent needs of the country. That very broadly is our policy.
But the opposition says that your party is directed more toward just one tribe. Is that the correct or incorrect assessment?
On the contrary, this is not so. The opposition is determined to try and set up little tribal states that they have chosen to call regional governments. Our party, on the other hand, believes that Kenya is too small, with 6 million people, to have more than one central government. We think it would be too costly to run more than one government. We also think that tribalism will be on the increase once you have regional tribal governments. So our party stands for a united Kenya nation in which all tribes learn to live together. This is what we have asked the Europeans and Asians to do, and there is no reason why we should not ask our own African brothers, regardless of their tribe, also to come together and integrate into one Kenya nation.
During this pre-independence period, the party in power is a minority group, the Kenya African Democratic Union. Its head has the title Leader of Government Business. He is Ronald Ngala, a quiet, pipe-smoking man who would look at home on a university campus. He talks of the aims of his party, a party which shows more concern for minorities and smaller tribes.
Look, there are three things. First, we stand for a democratic ideal. We believe that people should be free to express their views and their opinions without intimidation or threats or without any force. And we believe that if a country accepts two-party system before independence or after independence, this should be a free decision of the people themselves without any force. Thirdly, we believe that the constitution for free Kenya must be a regional constitution, a constitution that will have one unitary government for Kenya and have these reserved powers to the regions strongly entrenched into the written constitution of the country.
This is the great debate, not only in Kenya but everywhere in Africa. How strong should a central government be? In one country after another, the luxury of a two-party democratic system as we know it seems to fade away. Where he stands on this question and on the question of foreign policy is clearly stated by Tom Mboya.
Well, let me make this observation that although I have many friends in the West, I should not want it mistaken for any alliance with the West or being pro-West. I stand for a neutralist policy in which we will decide our relations with various countries entirely on the merits of a given situation. Now, the kind of governments that may emerge in a country like Africa must not be prejudged. Some people think that we will only have a democratic government if we have the kind of institutions that they have in mind. Well, I think this is wrong. It is true that from our colonial inheritance, we shall, in the first instance, have been used to a particular type of institution, namely that which is to be found in the metropolitan country of the colonial power. But we insist that after independence we must experiment with such institutions and patterns that fit into our own background, our own structure, our own social attitudes, and also our culture. Thus, in Africa, democracy will exist, but not necessarily in the same expression of institutions as one finds in America, Canada, United Kingdom, or France. It will have to be a type of institution that is African.
Nairobi itself is much more an Asian-looking city than African. There are 174,000 people of Asian extraction in Kenya, and many are small shop owners. One morning, during the season of what is called the small rains, with the windshield wipers beating out a rhythm, I went for a drive along Nairobi's main street, Government Road.
What's interesting about it is that as you drive down it, going, say, from the Norfolk Hotel, where I've been staying, to the New Stanley, you pass the various shops, and you think you were in Bombay. Listen to the names: Karamshi, Pandya, Shukla. These are named the Bombay Bazaar, Corner Kiosk, Fakirs. These are the Asian shops. The Asians are pretty well entirely the shopkeepers of the city. And of course, these people are wondering what is going to happen to them when independence comes.
When I spoke to Asians in Kenya, most expressed apprehension about the future. An Indian boy at the post office, when he heard I was a broadcaster from abroad, asked, "I was born here, and I shall have to leave. Where will I go?" At the moment, there are some Asians in government. Mr. Jomidar, a thoughtful, slightly nervous man, is Minister of Works. I asked him about the insecurity the Asians feel.
Well, there is undoubtedly that apprehension obtaining at the moment. I think the only hope for the Asian population is an expanding economy. If the economy remains static, then I think Asians will be squeezed out of that economy. But if it's a dynamic economy which keeps on expanding every year, then of course there will be room for everybody in the country, and we all should expect to be quite happy in the future.
Will the Asians in fact become Kenyans, or will they tend to remain or want to remain British?
Well, the large majority of my age group, that is around 40, is locally born and have no other home except Kenya. I should consider that most of them would like to take the new Kenyan citizenship whenever that is available.
Finally, it is your desire, I presume, to stay in Kenya, and I suppose to die in Kenya.
Well, certainly not to die. I would not like to die in any country, but I do propose to stay and live in Kenya.
Who will stay and who will go when independence comes? It is a question that is asked with great, deep soul-searching on the part of the European community, too. In Kenya, the Englishman has carved out a little bit of Britain.
Cricket. With 1 day to play, England are in a strong position in the first Test match against Pakistan at Lahore.
Daily, he listens to the BBC as if he were safely in his club in London. He keeps a watchful ear on the cricket world and reads the Times, but wonders where next year will find him. Michael Blundell.
My home is here, and my wife and I definitely intend to stay. I was given the opportunity 15 months ago of 2 most interesting appointments in elsewhere, but we didn't even look at it. Our home is here. Our daughter was born here, and as far as we are concerned, we want to die here.
Some of the white settlers have sold their land as best they can, but many will not move, no matter what.
By birth, I was much right to the part of the land which my father had and which I still own, as anybody else, in my opinion, in this world, and I see no reason at all why I should change. Just because the color of my skin is white, I cannot see any reason why I should have to leave this country, and I have no intention of doing so. I seek no special privileges other than to be allowed to carry on my daily work, have a certain amount of security for my wife and family, have a reasonable schools which my children can attend, and generally carry on the way I have done without seeking any privileges whatsoever.
I think in Kenya we're all a little bit worried about the future, but as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I think most other people are concerned, we all intend to stay, if possible.
Yes, I can't imagine a better place in the world to live in than Kenya. And as I told my daughter a year ago, who wanted me to go off to another country, Australia, it's not difficult to uproot a 75-year-old tree but it's impossible to transplant it and keep it alive.
But there are more than people involved. In the changing face of Kenya and all of Africa, its most famous treasure is vanishing, the wild animal. Nairobi has always been the safari capital of the world, made famous by Hemingway and Rourke. And a man who sees the problems of Kenya, not in terms of black or white or tribe against tribe, but through its wild game, is Mervyn Cowie, director of the Royal National Parks of Kenya.
It's quite logical that in any new country you can't have buffaloes running around in the wheat or lions in your pedigree cattle and mixing up like that. But it's perfectly logical that in certain places you can preserve wild animals, and in other places you have your agriculture and your cattle and your other human activities. So that I believe there's still room in Kenya and in East Africa, for that matter, to have places set aside as national parks where all these wild animals will be able to survive and live as they always have done. But assuming that all that is done, which can be done, we're then left with this horrible conundrum as what is the future of wild animals in the minds of the new African political leaders.
Has that question been answered at all? Has it come up?
It was partly answered at a recent conference we had in Arusha when a great number of world experts assembled there. And some of the East African countries, particularly Tanganyika, came out with flying colors because various African ministers made very profound statements that they intended to save wildlife because they recognized its economic value, its cultural value, and everything else. Well, now, those countries that have taken a lead, I believe, are on the right lines. And therefore, when Kenya settles down a bit and some of these fellows realize who's going to be in charge of the government, I hope they'll then turn attention to the main sources of national income. And wild animals really are one of those main sources because they attract tourists to this country, and tourism is a very potential pillar in the whole economic structure.
In the urge and rush to independence, the important question of economics is rarely discussed by African leaders. Kenya has a deficit economy. Financially, it is virtually broke. The need for planning is great. Money to finance projects must come from external sources. The great need for aid is put in perspective by Robert Marr, an American economic expert preparing a study on East Africa.
Well, at present, as you know, in East Africa, the budgets are divided into two halves, recurrent budget and development budgets. Recurrent are to take care of the day-to-day fixed charges. Development are all new expenses. Now, in relation to these new expenses, or the development budgets, in Kenya, 97% of the current plan, the 1960-1963 program, will have to be financed from loans and grants. In Tanganyika, 96%, and in Uganda, 72.8%.
But financial worries have not slowed the pace of the African Revolution. December 9, 1961, the Union Jack was lowered and a new national anthem was played as Tanganyika became the first of East African countries to achieve its independence. In the independent state of Tanganyika, songs were sung to greet and welcome the first black East African Prime Minister. In Tanganyika, there never was any question about who was going to be in charge of the government. Only one name was ever mentioned, and always it was accompanied by glowing tributes. His name, Julius Nyerere. Consider the words of East African expert Elspeth Huxley.
I don't think there's a country in Africa, really, where things have gone more smoothly. I don't say there haven't been any troubles. That is very largely due to the fact, a series of factors which resulted in Mr. Julius Nyerere coming out as the acknowledged leader of all the tribes and all the peoples, and the Europeans and the Indians, who were there in great numbers, accepted his leadership because he is a very attractive and a very moderate-minded man.
Consider, too, the compliments of Tanganyika's last governor, the man who is now her first Governor-General, Sir Richard Turnbull.
We've got in Mr. Julius Nyerere a man of most really exceptional quality. He's a natural leader, natural statesman, a man of the firmest principles, a man of great kindness and sense of humor, and a colleague of immense sympathy and understanding.
But the affairs of new African nations somehow never seemed tranquil. Not long ago, the man so universally praised, a man with almost universal support, stepped down as Prime Minister. 7 weeks after he guided his country to independence, Prime Minister Nyerere turned the Prime Minister's job over to his chief assistant, Rashidi Kawawa. But all experts feel that this was strictly a tactical move and only temporary. There is little doubt that Nyerere is very much in command. In fact, the party he heads, the Tanganyika African National Union, has virtually no opposition. Nyerere himself is a 40-year-old former school teacher. He is one of 26 children, a devout Catholic. He has a mild appearance, but an intense, dynamic manner. He greeted me in a formal parliamentary office, wearing a brilliant green sport shirt and open-toed sandals. And as he spoke, his eyes flashed with enthusiasm. I questioned him about many aspects of African life. I asked him if he felt any special responsibility because his country achieved independence so smoothly.
I can't really believe myself that we people in Tanganyika should regard ourselves as having greater responsibility over the continent or even in the context of East and Central Africa than others. It does happen that by a combination of historical circumstances that we have won our independence in a way which has not been possible in other countries. This gives us opportunities, but no more than that.
Even here in this country, which is considered so highly democratic, I believe there is no opposition party. Am I correct in that?
You are correct.
Would this not be a challenge to you, sir, since you have no opposition, to run a totally democratic process here?
What would be the challenge to me? We have what we believe here, a totally democratic situation. We certainly don't believe, and what has happened in Tanganyika at present doesn't make us change our minds, that democracy is merely a question of institutions, a question of form. We believe much more that democracy is an attitude of mind, that if a country goes to a free election with 2, 3, 4, 5 parties competing, that it's up to the electorate itself to throw out how many parties. They can return a weak parliament with 5 parties. They can return a very strong parliament with only 1 party. It's the attitude of mind. What happens then after that? This is what has happened in our own country. We fought an election and we won all the seats. The question is, come to our National Assembly and find out what is happening there. Do you find debate there? The kind of debate that you'd find in a 2-party system, or do you find a dictatorship there? I say you'll find in Tanganyika perhaps more debate than you might find in some of the 2-party system countries.
Do you think that colonialism has done any good at all? I mean, we're all familiar with the ills that it has brought, but has it brought any good?
Well, I'm told every cloud has a silver lining. It must have done some good. For instance, as a result of colonialism, instead of my inheriting 120 separate tribes, I'm inheriting a country which is one country with a single administration. Things like that have taken place. I have a single rail line which was built by colonial power and a few things like that. So I could point to a few quite good things which have been done by colonialism, but quite frankly, there are no excuse for colonialism.
Colonialism has a curious past in Nyerere's Tanganyika. There were Arabs there along its coast in the 8th century. Portuguese settled in a few places after Vasco da Gama went around the Cape of Good Hope. The Germans arrived in 1885 and made it one of their territories. But during the First World War, the British took over, and it became their mandate, as agreed to by the League of Nations and then the United Nations under its trusteeship system. Its size, it's about 4 times as big as Britain or as large as British Columbia. Its population is about 9 million. It has been spared the agony of Kenya because it has only 20,000 Europeans and they own only 2% of the land, and there are about 100,000 Asians. In general, it is a land of plains and plateaus, but within its 360,000 square miles are Africa's highest mountain, Kilimanjaro, and the continent's deepest lake, Tanganyika. Aside from the coastal area, the interior lies dark, primitive, and ignorant. Dar es Salaam, the capital, is a hot, humid coastal town where the rain seems to seep into everything, and the name means haven of peace. On the steps of the Lutheran church, where services are conducted in English and Swahili on a sticky evening, I talked to a boy about people and prejudice, while in the church a brass band of Africans was rehearsing a Sunday hymn.
These things were put by Europeans, when they first came in our country. But now we are trying to tell them that there are no difference, between them and ourselves, and that all men are equal. We are trying to tell them, but some Europeans are trying to understand this, but some, up to now, still not to understand. But they do understand, but still they put themselves into higher rank, Yeah, but our policy after independence is that the one who thinks is boss or is in a higher position than another person, then our policy is to tell that man to quit from this country,
I think myself that Africans are very tolerant of Europeans, considering the years which, they acted in a superior way here, wouldn't you say?
No,
but you do not feel any bitterness against the European yourself?
No, myself I don't. And I can say that I like them very much. Yeah. I like them to stay here even forever.
Yeah.
Yes. Because most of them are very helpful to Africans.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do the Europeans and Asians have a place in the new Tanganyika? The question is put to 32-year-old George Kahoma, Minister of Home Affairs.
Oh, certainly. Certainly. Of course, one has got to look at it from many points of views. There are Europeans or Asians who have been born here, who, although they are called Europeans and Asians, but in fact they are Tanganyikans. They know no other home. That's why our citizenship enactment is going to take all these factors into account, that Europeans and Asians will be able to qualify on different sections of the law to become Tanganyika citizens with full rights and so on. Again, of course, you will have Europeans and Asians who may come not to be as citizens, but they might come as investors. And we have always said that such people are always welcome.
One of the most pressing problems in Tanganyika and all over Africa is illiteracy. It is here that foreigners are most welcome to come and give their help and books. Here is a class of adult women who have never been to school before, reciting from the Oxford Reader for Africa.
My name is Luca Kaz. I have a mother and a father, 2 sisters, and a baby brother. And you, a brother and a sister, we have a big house near the...
One of those who came and will stay to help the new state along is Cranford Pratt. In all of Tanganyika, there are only about 1,200 high school graduates. Mr. Nyereri's TANU party, in its eagerness to get a sound education system going, turned over their brand new headquarters building to him to build a new university with no waiting.
In the field of education, there not only is the greatest need for trained people from outside to come and help, but this need is widely recognized by Africans, both ordinary Africans and African leaders, so that anyone interested in coming to serve at an African school or in an African university college will certainly be very welcomed and be given every opportunity. The wider question of the place of the European in African territories generally will in the long run depend on two things. It will depend on the attitude of the individual Europeans that come here, and it will depend on the political attitude of those who rise to leadership in the individual African states.
The Minister of Finance in the young Tanganyika was in fact British, Sir Ernest Vesey, but only a few weeks after independence he was forced to resign, and his departure from the first cabinet was instrumental in bringing about the resignation of Mr. Nyerere. At one time he was mayor of Nairobi. He chewed on the stub of a cigar in his office as he told me of what he thought were the prospects for the white man in East Africa.
I've always believed that if one preached democracy, one must accept democracy. I don't think the European as a European community will indeed have any great political influence, but I think the European as an individual with his competence, and provided he recognizes that he must regard himself as a citizen of the country in which he is living, I'm perfectly sure that there will be a great call upon the European for his advice and guidance in the years to come.
Virtually all these shops and the civil service in Dar es Salaam have been run by Asians. The Minister of Works is a good-looking Indian, Mr. Jamal, who considers himself very much an African. For years, the white man looked down on the Asians, and they in turn did the same to the African. But now things have changed, and I asked Mr. Jamal if it was not now necessary to have a greater social intercourse between the groups.
Yes, very much so. As you know, that one of our biggest legacies of the past has been the system of education. Up to now, we have had three separate streams of education, African, Asian, and European. And those of us who were very keenly interested in the future of a healthy, robust nation in this country, not just merely groups, but a nation, have been demanding for a long time now the integration of the education system. Well, now this has been brought about for the first time by the elected government, and the new education bill has just been passed by the National Assembly, which will result in an integrated system of education, and we hope that it will go a long way, although of course it will mean a lot of time before it really does take effect, but we hope it will go a long way to eliminating one very important source of division on this group basis.
Most Indians came to Africa to help build a railroad. About 32,000 of them were brought in to build a railroad from Mombasa on the coast of Kenya to Uganda to tap the wealth of that rich country. And in Uganda, they constitute the trading community. But Uganda has almost no white-black problem. Of a total population of about 6 million, there are only about 10,000 Europeans, and white settlement is forbidden by law. The country produces more coffee and cotton than anywhere else in the Commonwealth. Its social problems are strictly black versus black. And this year, this country, entirely inland, a quarter as big as Tanganyika, the size of Britain, will obtain its independence. The vital question is, will these three countries, Uganda, Tanganyika, and Kenya, form one federation, a federation of East Africa? An economist, Sir Ernest Vesey, on federation.
I don't think these territories can be separated economically, and indeed, in their own interests, it's paramount that they should be in one economic region or sphere. This will not only prevent political balkanization, but will mean that whoever directs the economy of the region will have an economy of sufficient size to have maneuverability, and this will undoubtedly hasten the economic progress of the region as a whole.
Economic unity seems to be a matter almost of form here. It seems to be completely necessary between these three states. However, the matter of political unity is something that others question very much. And
tendency in some areas perhaps to develop sort of a cult of the individual. How is it possible that these states will ever have one political leader?
Oh, I don't think there'll be any doubt about it. The common services which have now been started, the pattern of ministerial triumvirates that was accepted in the June discussions, make it quite easy at the appropriate point in the future for this to be moved onto a federal basis and for one minister to replace the triumvirate of three, which now operates various services. I think the only thing that is delaying the federation now is the fact that Tanganyika has got its independence first, and the other two countries feel that if they're to negotiate for a federation on an equal basis, they must get their political independence first.
Others feel a federation is necessary, but much more complex to bring about. Sir Richard Turnbull, Governor-General of Tanganyika.
The Federation of East Africa poses a very tricky constitutional problem and a tricky emotional problem. It's on the emotional side, one has to overcome the various rivalries and jealousies which are dividing Kenya at the moment and which exist so strongly in Uganda. But I'm pretty certain that when those two countries have been tidied up, provided the African leaders agree, we can very easily move into a federation. I say easily, it won't be as easy as all that, because the constitution making required for three countries of such different backgrounds as Tanganyika, Kenya and Uganda are pretty complicated. We've recently seen in the Caribbean how difficult it is to form a federation which will meet the commercial, agricultural, and again the psychological requirements of every member of it. But it can be done, and I think in East Africa it must be done, because if we're to flourish we must have a common market so that commercial firms can have access to what may be 20 or 25 million people instead of only 6, 7 and 10 million people.
I put this same question to Julius Nyerere. Will there be a federation of the East African states?
I don't know, except that I can say, I hope. I can express hope. But frankly, all these are artificial units, and they're weak units in any case. And one hopes that we'll get larger and larger units built up, not merely in Eastern and Central Africa, but I believe in the whole of Africa. Our hope in every respect is bound up with unity.
The question comes to the observer, well, who will be the boss then? I mean, do you foresee a time when there would be a prime minister for all of Eastern Africa?
I can't say about foresee, but I think the question, who will be the boss, is a mischievous question myself. Mm-hmm. One doesn't know. Mm-hmm. What we know is if you are going to have a government, the government is going to be headed by one person, two people. I don't care. It might be headed by a triumvirate. It might be headed by some people. Who it's going to be is absolutely ridiculous, because you never know when it's going to happen. You don't know, and even if you knew when it was going to happen, it is not really the vital matter. The vital matter is if we don't like the balkanization of East Africa, for instance, we move ahead and remove the balkanization. Who ends up as the head of a larger state is completely irrelevant, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The reason I asked the question is not to be mischievous, but there is a fear, I think, in some quarters that there may be some cults of personality developing in some areas of Africa, and I think Western observers need some kind of assurance that that isn't going to take place, and that is really the reason for the question.
Frankly, I don't see why we should give an assurance to Western observers about anything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the unity of Africa is our own business. The machinery, the institutions we set up are completely our own business. The individuals who emerge out of this to head whatever unit we build up must be left to a democratic process in Africa.
Who would be the boss if a federation did take place has been seriously considered by an American expert on Africa, Robert Marr.
Under a federal structure, as you probably know, today they are speaking about Jomo Kenyatta as being equivalent to the Governor General or the President of the Federation. They are speaking of Nyerere as being the Prime Minister of the East African Federation. They are speaking about Tom Mboya being the Foreign Minister of an East African Federation. This raises a question which has always bothered me. What will happen to Uganda? No one ever seems to consider their role in an East African Federation. I would presume that a very good argument could be made for making the Home Minister in charge of internal security and perhaps defense a Ugandan. And the problem, of course, can become more complex if Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland and Rwanda-Urundi should also be included in the Federation. But I believe that the latter three are still a bit in the future, and I think if we concentrate just on the three states of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika, we'll have enough problems in getting those three together.
To speculate on the future of the East African Federation is perhaps idle. To speculate about the future of any African state is not practical. The Africans will do it their own way and in their own time. We may not understand it, but in the words of Julius Nyerere, it is their own affair. The African Revolution is sometimes dramatic, sometimes peaceful, but once it has started, nothing, no man, can stop it. One night, I drove out to the Nairobi airport, and under a full awesome hunter's moon, I drove by the road that passes through the Nairobi National Park. The eyes of wildebeest along the roadside reflected the glare of the modern automobile that took me there. They stared out as animals have, perhaps as before any man, black or white, had ever come to the great landmass that is Africa. At the airport, a crowd of Africans filled the terminal. The women, swinging, swaying, chanted a song of farewell. An African boy was going off to study at a university in America. The whole village had come to say goodbye. A superjet was to take him to Rome and then across the ocean. Most of the townspeople perhaps had never been out of their village, never seen or heard the sound of an engine. They waited till dawn, dancing barefoot on the concrete floor of the chrome and glass building, waiting for a jet. Brilliant metal earrings, dozens of them, hung in the ears of women as they had for centuries. But now, Uhuru was coming. In their bright dresses and robes, they made a sight that was like a moving human rainbow from the black past to the 20th century, rushing into the African Revolution.
Uhuru Means Freedom, program number 2 in a 6-part series on the African Revolution. The series was prepared by broadcaster Harry Rasky after a tour with tape recorder of 15 African countries south of the Sahara. The African Revolution was produced for the international service of the CBC by Bernard Murphy.
Mama,